All righty, it is 1 o'clock. I would like to welcome everyone to the UW-Madison Division of Extension program, the USDA Dairy Margin Coverage Update. My name is Ashley Olson, and I am the agriculture educator in Vernon County. I will be your moderator today. We will go through the program with Dr. Mark Stephenson, and if you have any questions throughout the program, please feel free to put them in the chat box, or afterwards, you are more than welcome to ask the question as well. So with that, I would like to introduce Dr. Mark Stephenson, the director for the Center for Dairy Profitability and Dairy Analysis, Policy and Analysis at UW-Madison. So welcome, Mark.
Thank you, Ashley. Yeah, I'm going to cover the Dairy Margin Coverage Program this year. We have some changes that have been made to the program, as indeed has been the case in many of the years since the program's existed, but I don't really think it's too complicated for decision making this year. I think this will be a relatively short program, but you are welcome to ask as many questions as you want, and I'll stay on as long as people have questions to ask. So let's go ahead and move right on into this. We have a number of things in the way of risk management options that farms can do. One of the things some farms choose to do is absolutely nothing, and that would be what we call self-insuring. This is not a wrong option. I mean, for example, if Bill Gates decided that he didn't want to get health insurance, then I'm pretty sure that Bill Gates can fund any medical procedure known to mankind out of his pocket. Perfectly acceptable thing to do. All forms of insurance or risk management in the long run are going to cost you something. They're going to be a net cost, not a net gain. But in any particular year, they may really help you from having a very bad outcome. So do nothing's an option, but I don't necessarily encourage people to do that. One of the most common things that's been available for a long time have been futures and options contracts. You can sell a contract at prices that are negotiated on the futures markets, Chicago Mercantile Exchange. You can sell options on those contracts or purchase options on those contracts. And those are both ways of managing risk. You can work with your co-op or your plant to have cash forward contracts for your milk with a secured milk price. Those plants or co-ops will generally turn right around and manage their risk that they've assumed from you now in the futures market by either selling a contract or managing it with options. So one way or another, we're going to probably use the futures contracts. There are some off-contract or off-market things that are called swaps that have been used. They're more complicated and certainly not going to talk about that. We've had livestock gross margin for dairy for quite a few years. And more recently, we've also had dairy revenue protection. But today I really want to talk about dairy margin coverage. And this dairy margin coverage program is a revision of what was originally offered as the margin protection program for dairy. And we'll just go through a little bit of the dairy margin coverage program this year. But the futures markets do provide a clearinghouse for information. They tell us something about what we can expect in the way of information about prices. They're a huge sponge for all kinds of reports and information, things about weather or politics or general economy or production reports or COVID or anything else. And they try to find agreement with a person on the other side of risk management at a point in time about what you think the future value of the product is going to be. And if you find people who are trying to hedge or indeed speculators in the marketplace as well on both sides of a trade and you agree, then you may have the basis for trade or at least an offer that's not covered. This transfers risk from people who want to hedge, whether you're selling milk or indeed buying milk like a processor would, and it provides a profit motive for speculators who are willing to accept risk. Now, mind you, they're going to be accepting that risk in the marketplace for what they think is going to be a small profit. But this also provides price discovery for all the rest of us. We can sit it out if we don't want to be involved in futures markets, but just watch and see what daily trading is doing to tell us something about what the rest of the people who do have money on the line are actually thinking. Those futures markets are always going to be wrong about the price in the long run, but we have no evidence that they're biased. In other words, they don't always tend to be on the high side or the low side of what actually happens. The closer we get to an expiration date or the end of a contract, the more accurate those future prices become. So futures markets are really a great place to kind of look at all the information that people are taking in, and folks who actually do have money on the line to think about securing a risk that they may have. Options markets are a byproduct of futures markets, and they provide the right to own the underlying futures contract at a specified price. That cost of the options premium out there reflects the likelihood that you're going to have to supply the underlying contract to somebody on the other side of a trade and at that specified price. If the commodity's harder to predict, in other words, it's more volatile, then the option contract will cost more. And if the expiration date is further out, I mean, months out, 6, 8 months out, we're less certain about market conditions and what they're going to be when the contract actually closes. So the option will cost more for far out dates. We can use those kind of options prices out there to calculate what the risk of the price forecast actually is. So futures markets with the actual hedging contracts and options on those contracts provide a lot of information to a marketplace. Let's talk about the dairy margin coverage program this year. The mechanism is exactly the same as the margin protection program really was from the 2014 Farm Bill. In other words, you've got a milk price that they're looking at, and you've got the value of a feed ration that's calculated, and it's the difference between that milk price and the feed cost, estimated feed cost to produce that 100 weight of milk. Now, this isn't your milk price. It is a national average milk price, and it's what we call the all milk price. It includes the different levels of components in milk that we see. In other words, the protein and the butter fat. And the feed price is not your feed price either, but it is a ration that's meant to able to provide a cow with enough nutrients to produce 100 pounds of milk at average levels of milk production. So that basic structure of the margin program is the same, but we have changed a few of the parameters in there. In 2019, we moved from that margin protection program to what we now call the dairy margin coverage program, and it's based on the same milk and feed prices. And farms choose a coverage level that you want to have protection for, and you pay the premium. Higher coverage levels require higher premiums out there, and you can only cover a percentage of your historic production. Most of the parameters of the program were actually tweaked in some way to make it more farmer friendly back in 2019. You might recall that we had a number of changes that were made to the program in 2020, also where we had, for instance, new levels of coverage that were added. So we went from a peak of $8 margins up to $9.50 in 50-cent increments. So anywhere from $4 to $9.50 in tier 1 could be purchased in 50-cent increments. They also lowered the price of all of those contracts in tier 1. They actually raised them a bit in tier 2. But for the most part, it made it more farmer friendly, and particularly towards smaller farms in that time period. Some parameters were changed again this year, and I'll point those out for you because they can be really quite important to a few individuals. We also are using those futures markets to forecast possible margins for the year ahead for 2022. That may help inform you about your choice in risk management, but I'm going to ask you to please not try to use that and think about ways to game the system, so to speak. In other words, don't look at do I think I can make money on the program this year? That's not what risk management is about. And if you want to actually think about that, go back to 2019. You may recall that in the fourth quarter of 2019, futures markets were forecasting really terrific prices for 2020. And we had a lot of folks who had come through some rough years and just decided, why would I even spend 15 cents to protect my margin if we're unlikely to have payments that year? Well, of course, that was the year when COVID showed up. And we actually had really very low prices for many of the months. And it was not a good choice for folks that did that. That's not risk management when you're trying to think about capturing just the highs and avoiding the costs on a good year. The enrollment for this next year, for 2022, actually already started back in December, on December 13th, and it's going to end on February 18th. You still have plenty of time, but it's about a month, roughly speaking, that you'll need to think about your decision and be sure to get into the Farm Service Agency office and let them know what it is you want to do. And I wouldn't wait till the last day, because there are some things that will be changing over the course of this year for many people that will need to be done ahead of time. So what's changed this year? Well, one of the things that's changed a few years ago, back in 2019, 2020, is that we added supreme alfalfa to the dairy ration instead of just the average alfalfa that was being used to calculate the value of the ration. That gave us a difference from what that blue line is showing you on here to what the red line is showing you. We added 50% supreme alfalfa value and 50% of the regular alfalfa value. This year, FSA decided that we are going to have only supreme alfalfa. That's what's often called dairy quality alfalfa. And this is going to be the only hay value. This has the impact of raising or elevating the cost of the ration value to that green line, or at least the inclusion of alfalfa in the ration to that green line value. Now, what that really does is that it will trigger a payment more often, the more expensive the ration is, because you're subtracting a bigger feed value from the milk price. So the supreme alfalfa value is actually being back calculated to January 2020 with the coverage that you selected. So if you enrolled last year, and let's just say you did enroll at the 950 level, they're going to go back and see what the additional value of the indemnity payments were for January 2020 and 2021 with supreme alfalfa value, and you should be receiving a check in the mail. You don't need to do anything to make that happen. This will just happen as a result of your enrollment choices over the last couple of years. The second big thing that I really want to make note of is that for the first time, really, since the program's been in place, we've had a chance to increase our annual historic production. Now, you may remember that the annual historic production was the highest level of marketings that you would have had on your farm in 2011, 2012, or 2013. So you would look backward in those 3 years, and the highest level of milk production that you sold during that time period became your annual historic production. We've had a few things along the way that were referred to as bumps in that. This was based a little bit on production increases or changes but along the way, but those are pretty minor. a lot of folks have said that, my milk production has grown quite a bit. My production per cow has grown. Maybe I've added a few cows. And so now we have an opportunity to increase milk production at least up to 5 million pounds. So it's not going to be all the way. What is happening is look back at your annual 2019 actual marketings. That's what's going to be taken. And you can look back at your annual historic production. And the difference between those two things, they will allow 75% of that difference to be added to your previous annual historic production. As I mentioned, the maximum is 5 million pounds. So just to give you an example, if your original annual historic production was 2 million pounds of milk, that's what, roughly 90 cows, something like that. And if your 2019 marketings was now something more like 4.5 million pounds, that's perhaps up to 200 cows or something close to that. Your new annual production, historic production, is actually going to be your original 2 million pounds plus the 4.5 million pounds that you marketed in 2019 minus your original 2 million pounds times 75%, which gives you a new annual historic production of 3.875 million pounds. So if you had, say, increased your milk marketings up to 7 million pounds from that 2 million pounds, you would have capped out at 5 million pounds of production. You can't have more than that, but it gives you the chance to now have maximum production under Tier 1. The payments on your new annual historic production will also be back calculated from 2021 coverage levels. You'll also have to pay additional premiums, but there'll be a net benefit for anybody that can do that. This whole new recalculation is called supplemental DMC enrollment. And this is something that's going to have to be done before you make your selection for the new year, because you'll want the additional marketings that are available, potentially available to you. So for smaller farms, opportunity to increase your annual historic production and provide better coverage for you on the farms. Now, I just wanted to let you know that, we use the futures markets out here to make forecasts of what we think the margins are going to be. This graphic is showing you in that solid red line what the margins have been in the past, and the dashed line on the right-hand side are showing you the forecasts of, based on current futures markets, what we think the margin is likely to be going forward over this next year. Now, I would caution you, you can look at this and realize that, boy, we don't really look like we're expecting any forecasts of margins that would trigger a payment, when the payment's down here at this 950 level. And that's true. We're expecting all of 2022 to be above that level. But recall, back in 2019, we had very high payments up here, or no payments up here because of very high margins, pretty good year for dairy producers in the fourth quarter. And we were not forecasting what actually happened, which is including this deep dip. This was the lowest level of margin that we had had since the programs began at that point in time. And producers that decided to set this one out and not pay the margins that year, or the premiums that year, missed all of these potential payments, and they were substantial. So, we're forecasting a pretty good year for milk prices, but remember, this is risk management, and you have to ask yourself whether paying something for premiums to put a floor under prices is actually a worthwhile thing to do. It is real money. This is another way to look at this, and this is also another graph that's available on our Dairy Markets and Policy webpage. But again, using the daily futures and options values that we have, it's calculating a likelihood of payout. And you'll notice at the 950 level of payout, of course, which is only available in tier one, the first up to the first 5 million pounds of milk production, there's about a 50% probability right now that you'd receive a payment. We actually aren't forecasting payments, but at this level of 950, it is close enough that we would expect it's kind of 50-50 as to whether the markets would actually decline and pull you into notion where you would have a positive net benefit. That means cover your 15-cent premium payments on enrollment at the 950 level. And you can see that for these other levels, the probability gets smaller and smaller because it would take a pretty bad outcome for us to actually get down here. But again, that happened in 2020. This is showing you a screen web shot of the current tool that we have for making your production decisions out there. I'm going to try to switch my screen sharing and go to the live tool and just show you this if I can. And you will have to let me know, Ashley or somebody else, if I am on that screen. If not, I may need to change it. Am I on the live screen, Ashley?
Not right now.
Okay, well, let me see if I can do that. Okay, screen sharing. I'm going to stop the screen sharing and try it again, and I will pick that screen. And now you should see it.
Yes.
Okay. When you come on to this, and the URL for this is DMC, which dairy margin coverage, .dairymarkets, all one word, .org. And you'll notice over here that the first thing you get dropped into is coverage selection. That's showing you this darkened tab up here. You should also change it to the 2022 year so that we're making sure that we're forecasting ahead. And you can put in your annual historic production. There is information if you hover over this as to what that actually means. But, you know, let's just say that we actually have 7 million pounds of annual historic production, and I've chosen the coverage percentage at 95%. You can't cover 100% of your annual historic production, but in 5% increments, you can go a long way down, and you can cover all the way up to 95%. So if you do that, you will notice in the upper right-hand corner, it's showing you what your coverage selections currently are, what the cost of the premium would be, and you know, how much milk is actually covered there. So right now it kind of defaults to this 950 level in tier one, and the highest you can choose in tier two is $8. You'll also notice that that's actually a pretty expensive premium. I'm not suggesting that most folks would find that to be a good choice to make, but if you look on down, you can go down to a $4 level of coverage, which is what the Farm Service Agency refers to as catastrophic coverage, and that's available to you at no cost. So your first 5 million pounds of milk of annual historic production is covered at the 950 level and costing you 15 cents per hundredweight, and the rest of your milk, the 1,650,000 pounds that you're covering here, doesn't cost you anything. Now, actually, if you look up these coverage levels, I'm going to go so far as to say some of this coverage is actually pretty cheap. So if you look, for example, at this $5 level of coverage, that is much more likely to make a payment than a $4 premium. That's truly catastrophic. So is $5. Don't, you know, let's not quibble about that. That's catastrophic prices. But it would only cost me a half a penny to provide that level of catastrophic coverage on my additional milk, or $82 for the year. Now, I might be willing to do that. In fact, I probably would personally. You'll notice also that as you jump up to somewhat higher levels of coverage, it begins to get more expensive fairly quickly. So maybe 10 cents still looks pretty good to you for the rest of your tier two. But for me, I'm going to stick with the choice of 15 cents and this half a penny on tier 2. This next tab on here gives you net benefit forecasts. And this should have actually stayed at 7 million pounds, but it didn't. And it's only going to look at the tier 1 and tier 2, well, payments out here. And you'll notice that it's not currently forecasting anything in the year 2022. So, the likelihood of a payment is pretty low. Like I told you, 50-50 at the 950 level, 50%. And very little actually at the $5 level for tier 1, but it's still there nonetheless. The price forecasts are going to show you month by month what the futures market forecast would be for the all milk price here in this column, the corn value, the supreme alfalfa, the soybean meal, and this is your total ration forecast. And then finally, what the dairy margin would be over here on the right. I would look at this and say, you can see why we aren't expecting payments, because even though the feed forecast or ration value is actually fairly high, this is a really strong milk price. We're looking at $22, $23 a hundredweight for most of the year coming up. It should be a fairly good year for dairy farmers. This historic performance is just a means of letting you go back over time and see how often, for the choices you've made, you would have had a net benefit on your operation. So this is showing you year by year. 2009 was a bad year for dairy farmers. This program, had it been in place then, and it wasn't, but if it had, would have paid quite a bit per hundredweight. That would have been the difference between real suffering and maybe just getting by reasonably well. 2014 was a great year in the cash markets. As such, you paid your premiums and really didn't get any net benefits. But you can see how often or how frequently this would have paid out at the choices you've made. This final tab up here is showing you what we call the level of milk price that you're protecting. And this is using the feed cost values that we have forecast out here. And those are the same ones that you would have seen in some of the earlier tabs. And it's looking at the level of coverage that you selected in tier 1, the 950. You can add a local basis to this. Now remember, this is the US all milk price. And actually our price in Wisconsin tends to be a bit higher than the US average price is. You could look at your milk checks and make a determination as to what you think your basis is relative to that US all milk price. Let's just say it's $1. If that's so, it's telling you that you are protecting something like a 22.5 or $22 milk price in the year ahead. That's what a 950 level of margin protection would be giving you. So this is a way to use this decision tool and make your forecasts and make your selection choices so that you're all ready when you go in and talk to the Farm Service Agency. I'm stopping my sharing, I guess, right now, and just wanted to take any questions that people may have or have sent in, Ashley.
All right, at this time, if anybody does have any questions for Mark, feel free to put them in the chat, or if you're not able to use that feature, you may unmute yourself and ask the question. At the moment, we do not have any questions in the chat box.
And you know, Ashley, I might not be surprised. Again, I don't think this is a difficult year to make this choice. The dairy margin coverage program is generous, in my opinion, and it's really very good risk protection for most farms. At the smaller farms, is what I really meant to say. So if you've got 200 cows or less, you can probably do most all of the risk management that's needed. For example, in a year like this, with $22 milk that we're expecting, if you're having a hard time making ends meet, you've probably got some bigger problems than just risk management this year. You'll need to really be looking at how do you contain or perhaps reduce some of your costs of production. If you're a larger farm, 5 million pounds of milk is not going to be adequate protection. But I wouldn't neglect this either. It's an easy thing to do to get that much level of coverage on the first 5 million pounds of milk production that you have. Beyond that, you'll probably need to do something in either the futures market or with livestock dairy revenue protection or with dairy RP, either one, any one of those things.
Thank you for that. We did have a question come in. And it's asking, when a dairy farmer wants to sign up for the supplemental DMC coverage, would they just need to provide the FSA office with a statement from the creamery on the 2019 production history, or?
Yes, they aren't going to just take your word for it. You will need to bring in either your monthly checks or an annual statement from the plant or co-op, about what your 2019 marketings were.
As we wrap this up today, we do have a few questions to ask and of you if you would like, and just a couple of promotions that we do have coming up with extension of other great programs. We have our Wisconsin Dairy and Beef Animal Wellbeing Conference coming up in February. So if that is something you're interested in, can definitely go to details and register down at the bottom of the link, or contact one of your extension agents. And then we also have our Badger Dairy Insight series that is going on, and had our first one yesterday, and we hear some of the upcoming programs we have going on as well. We'd like to thank you all for joining us today. And again, if you do have any more questions, feel free to let us know. Thank you.